My name is Mara. I'm 35. My husband's name is Jake. We run a private investigation firm. I've told this story maybe a dozen times since it happened, usually to other investigators over bad diner coffee, and every single time, someone stops me at the same point and asks the same question: did you know, right then, that it wasn't going to end where you thought it would end? The honest answer is no. I didn't know any of it. Not the half of the story hiding inside the story. Not the man who'd spend 2 years quietly watching a stranger's marriage before he ever said a word to me. Not the woman running a motel counter who'd end up mattering more to my family than anyone could have guessed on a Tuesday morning in June. All I knew, standing in my kitchen with a coffee pot that refused to hurry, was that my phone had just buzzed with a message that was about to blow a 14-year-old wound wide open, and I had absolutely no idea it was also about to open 2 others nobody had ever known existed. Welcome back to Behind Closed Doors Revenge, where quiet people finally say the things that took years to say, and families learn what presence actually means. If stories like this tend to find you at the right time, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. The morning we were supposed to leave town for the Kowalski job, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter like it was trying to crawl away from something. Jake and I had been running Hale and Vance investigations for 6 years by then, long enough that a buzzing phone at 6 in the morning didn't mean anything except client wants an update they already have. He was standing over the coffee maker, willing it to hurry up, while I crammed a granite-colored blazer into a duffel bag, because the Kowalski job meant 3 days of hotel lobby surveillance and I hated ironing on the road. Facebook, I said, glancing at the screen. Somebody I don't know. Delete it, Jake said. Hang on. I frowned, the way I frowned at surveillance photos that didn't quite add up. He's asking if I know Renata. Jake stopped moving. In our house, in our marriage, in the 6 years we'd built a business out of other people's worst days, there was exactly one name that could make the air in the room change temperature, and that was it. Renata Hale. My stepmother. The woman who had spent 14 years turning my father's house into a place I wasn't welcome in. Who is it? Jake asked. I didn't answer right away. I was reading, my thumb frozen over the screen, and I could feel my own face doing something it had only done once before, on a night 4 years earlier when a client's kid called to say her dad wasn't answering the phone and we both already knew why. He says he's a fireman, I said slowly. Says his wife cheated on him a few months ago and it wrecked him, and he can't just let it happen to somebody else without saying something. Okay. He says last night he was driving some back road out past Route 9, saw what looked like 2 cars broken down, pulled over to help. I looked up at Jake. By the time he got to the back windows he realized nobody needed help changing a tire. Jake set the coffee pot down. He ran the plates, I said. Different last names, different addresses, registered to a house not 15 minutes from Dad's. He couldn't find a way to reach the husband, so he looked up who else might be connected. Found me instead. Renata drives a bike, Mara. Everybody knows that. She doesn't drive a car out on some. He sent pictures. That was the sentence that ended the conversation about the Kowalski job, at least for the next 10 minutes. I turned my phone toward Jake, and there they were, a woman's silhouette through a fogged rear window, unmistakably not the driver's own reflection, and a man's forearm braced against a headrest that did not belong to my father. It wasn't graphic. It didn't need to be. 6 years of doing this exact work for other people's marriages had taught us both exactly what we were looking at within about 2 seconds. I sat down at the kitchen table like my strings had been cut. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it would be easy, telling this story later, to make it sound like grief, or shock, or even anger. It wasn't. It was relief so total it looked almost like laughter, and then it was laughter, and then it was crying, and I genuinely could not tell you which of those 3 things came first, because they seemed to be happening simultaneously, the way water finds every crack in a dam at once. She's finally going to get what's coming to her, I said, half laughing, wiping my face with the heel of my hand. After everything. After boarding school. After every birthday she made sure Dad was too busy for. After she convinced him I was the reason his second marriage was hard. I looked up at Jake, eyes bright and wet. Somebody just handed us the door out. A total stranger. Jake sat down across from me and did the only thing that 6 years of this job had trained into his spine. He made me slow down. "We sit on this for 24 hours, he said. "Jake. 24 hours. We don't call your dad. We don't message this fireman back with anything more than a thank you. We think it through like it's a client's case, because that's exactly what it is, except this time you're not allowed to be objective, which means I have to be twice as objective for the both of us." I hated that. I agreed to it anyway, because underneath the joy there was something in me that had learned a long time ago not to trust good news that arrived too easily. That instinct, I want you to remember that instinct. It's going to matter later, more than either of us understood sitting in that kitchen. We cancelled the Kowalski job entirely by 9 a.m. I remember thinking, as Jake typed out the apologetic email to a client who would never know the real reason, that this was probably the strangest morning of our marriage so far. I had no idea it wasn't even going to crack the top 3. To understand why a grainy photo from a stranger could undo a grown woman standing in her own kitchen, you have to understand what Renata Hale had spent 14 years doing to me, one small cruelty at a time. My mother died when I was 7. Cancer, fast and merciless, the kind that doesn't leave a family time to prepare so much as it leaves them time to watch. My father, Walter, a good man by every account except the one that mattered, which was present, did what a lot of grieving, overwhelmed men do. He remarried within 2 years, to a woman 11 years younger than him named Renata, who had never had children and, as it turned out, had very specific ideas about how much room a dead wife's daughter should take up in a new marriage. The answer, as I grew up learning, was, as little as possible. It started small. Family photos that somehow never included me. A birthday party rescheduled twice until it quietly stopped happening at all. Then, when I was 11, Renata got pregnant with the first of what would eventually be 3 children, and the small cruelties became structural. Boarding school, for states away, suggested gently to my father as just so much better for her education, don't you think, with everything going on here? There's a version of my childhood Jake only ever got in fragments, usually late at night, usually after a case that hit too close to something I didn't like to name directly. The Christmas I was 13, when Renata told my father that my train ticket home had gotten too complicated to sort out this year, a train ticket, not a plane ticket, a distance that could have been solved with 2 hours and a car, if anyone had wanted to solve it. The graduation Renata didn't attend because it overlapped with the boys' recital, even though the boys were 4 and 2 years old at the time and had no recital. The slow, deliberate erasure of a stepdaughter from a family album, one skipped photo at a time, until I genuinely couldn't remember the last time I'd seen my own face in a picture from that house. It's never one big thing with someone like her, I told Jake once. That's what makes it so hard to prove, even to yourself. It's 1,000 small things, and every single one of them technically has an excuse, and if you ever say the sentence out loud, "I think my stepmother is trying to erase me," you sound insane. So, you stop saying it. You just quietly leave, the way I did, and you build a whole life somewhere else, and you tell yourself you're fine, because being fine is easier than being the daughter nobody wanted to fight for. My father, for his part, was not a villain. That's important to say plainly, because this story would be simpler if he were. He was a man who had lost a wife too young, remarried too fast, and then spent the better part of 2 decades in a fog of guilt he didn't know how to metabolize into action. I told Jake once, early in our relationship, that the worst thing about my father wasn't cruelty. It was cowardice. He knows what she does, I said. He's known for years. He just doesn't know how to be the man who does something about it. Which is what made the fireman's message, on that ordinary Tuesday morning, feel less like an accident and more like an answer to a question I had stopped asking a long time ago. Neither of us knew yet that the man who sent it had been asking a version of the exact same question about his own life for the better part of 2 years. We didn't sleep much during our self-imposed waiting period. Jake called the Kowalski client and pushed the job back 3 days, citing a family emergency, which was not a lie even if it wasn't the kind of emergency they'd have guessed. I spent the first several hours the way I spend every hard emotion, by working. I pulled up everything we had access to: public records, property filings, the small digital footprint Renata Hale had left behind over the years, and built a file the way I'd build a file for any client. Except this client was my own life. His name's Dale, I said around 10 a.m., scrolling through the fireman's Facebook profile. Dale Corbin. Volunteer fire department out in Wren County. Married, no kids listed, profile pictures from a fishing trip 2 summers ago. Anything that looks off? Jake asked. No. I frowned at the screen like I wanted there to be something off, because 14 years in this family had taught me that good things arriving without a catch was itself the catch. He looks like exactly what he says he is. A guy who got burned and can't stand to watch it happen to someone else. Jake told me later that something about Dale Corbin's message had nagged at him that day, something he hadn't said out loud yet because he didn't want to slow us down with a hunch he couldn't back up. It wasn't the content was plausible, even generous, in the way total strangers are sometimes generous in ways institutions and family members fail to be. It was the specificity. The man hadn't just seen 2 cars and driven on. He'd stopped, walked back, taken photos with the presence of mind of someone who'd done exactly this kind of thing before, and then run plates with an ease that suggested either law enforcement experience or something closer to home than concerned citizen. He didn't say any of that yet. He filed it away, the way you file away a detail in any case, not urgent, not dismissible, just noted. Around noon, Jake asked me the question he'd been sitting on since we first read the message. Does it bother you that we don't actually know this guy from anywhere? That a total stranger just handed you the one thing you've wanted for 20 years? I didn't answer right away. I kept scrolling, kept building the file, and when I finally looked up, I could feel my own eyes doing the thing they do right before I crack a case wide open. It bothers me a normal amount, I said. Which is to say, yes, obviously, it's strange. People don't do this. Strangers don't drive around at midnight rescuing families they've never met from marriages they know nothing about, out of pure civic decency. There's usually a reason underneath the reason. But even if there's something else going on with him, even if his motives aren't as clean as concerned fireman, it doesn't change what's in those photographs. Renata's cheating either way. Whatever's driving him doesn't undo what he found. It was, I think back on many times in the weeks that followed, one of the smartest things I said in that entire 24 hours, and also the exact reason we didn't push harder, sooner, to find out what was actually driving Dale Corbin. We let the question sit, because the case in front of us, Renata, my father, the marriage that had already cost me so much, mattered more urgently than the motives of the messenger. It would be 5 weeks before either of us circled back to it. By early afternoon, I had moved from research into planning, which Jake recognized as the healthiest possible use of my adrenaline. If we tell Dad today, I said, he panics, he confronts Renata alone, she lawyers up before we've built anything, and this becomes a 5-year custody and asset fight that she wins because she's had 14 years to plan for exactly this eventuality. So, we don't tell him today, Jake said. We get him somewhere neutral. Lunch. Public enough that nobody has a meltdown, private enough that we can actually talk. My voice cracked slightly for the first time since the laughing crying at the kitchen table. Jake, I need this to be airtight. Not for me. For him. If this doesn't hold up, if she wiggles out of it somehow, he goes right back into the fog, and I don't think I get another chance at this. That was the moment I understood we weren't running a case anymore. We were running the only rescue mission either of us would ever care about more than the ones we got paid for. We picked a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who'd worked there since before either of us was born, because my father always felt safer somewhere unglamorous. He doesn't trust anywhere that tries too hard, I told Jake in the car. Never has. My father was 61 years old, built like a man who used to do manual labor and now mostly supervised people who did, with a face that had spent 2 decades apologizing without ever quite finding the words for what it was apologizing for. He slid into the booth across from us looking wary, the way he always looked wary whenever I asked to see him without warning, because I think some part of him always expected the conversation where I finally told him exactly what 14 years of being sidelined had cost me. "You said tough issues," he said, before he'd even ordered coffee. "Is everything okay? Are you too?" "We're fine, Dad," I said, choosing, right there, to lead with kindness instead of the decade of resentment I had every right to lead with. "This isn't about us," I told him. Not everything at once. Jake and I had agreed in the car that I would describe the situation first, in general terms, before showing him anything, so he had a second to brace himself. My father listened with the stillness of a man who has spent a long time expecting bad news and has developed the discipline not to interrupt it. When I finally slid the manila envelope across the table and he opened it and looked at the photographs, Renata's silhouette, the unfamiliar forearm, the timestamp Dale Corbin had thoughtfully included, I watched something happen to my father's face that I will remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't devastation. I had braced myself for devastation, had rehearsed comforting words in the car just in case. What actually happened was that my father's shoulders, which I realized in that instant had been raised somewhere near his ears for probably 2 decades, came down. His whole body seemed to exhale at once. He set the photos down on the table, folded his hands over them, and looked up at me with an expression that was, unmistakably, relief. "I've known something was wrong for years," he said quietly. "The bike rides. The girls' trips that never had any pictures with actual girls in them. The way she'd get a phone call and take it in the garage with the door shut." He shook his head. I told myself I was imagining it because the alternative meant I'd have to do something, and I didn't know how. "Your mother's been gone 22 years, Mara, and some days I think I never really finished grieving her before I tried to build a whole new life on top of it. I built it on sand. And I let that sand bury you, and I have never forgiven myself for that, and I never will." I reached across the table and took his hand, and for the first time in longer than either of us could remember, my father cried in front of me without trying to hide it. "We need more," Jake said gently, once the moment had settled enough to talk logistics. "One tip from a stranger isn't going to survive a good lawyer, Walter. If Renata fights this, and she will fight this, because 14 years tells us exactly what kind of fighter she is, we need documentation that holds up without needing Dale Corbin to testify about a country road at midnight." My father nodded slowly. "Whatever you two need to do. I trust you both completely." I squeezed his hand once more before letting go. This was no longer a family emergency I happened to have professional skills for. This was a case. My case. And we were going to do it right. There's a particular quiet discipline to surveillance that people who've never done it tend to imagine as more dramatic than it is. It isn't car chases. It's coffee going cold in a cup holder. It's parking 200 yards down from a house with a good sightline and a bad view, adjusting a long lens through a cracked window, and waiting for hours for 5 minutes of footage that will matter. We picked up Renata's pattern on the first morning without much trouble, because 14 years of getting away with something tends to make a person careless in exactly the way we depend on for a living. She left the house at 9:15 in full cycling gear, helmet, padded shorts, a sleek road bike she loaded onto a rack on the back of her SUV rather than riding from the driveway, which struck me immediately as strange. "She doesn't ride from the house," I murmured, watching through the viewfinder. "She drives somewhere first." We followed at a careful distance, the kind of distance you learn only through years of doing this and getting burned the times you didn't. Renata drove 11 miles out to a gravel pull-off along an old county road, the same road, we'd later confirm, where Dale Corbin said he'd stopped 3 nights earlier, unloaded the bike, and rode it exactly 400 yards down the road before pulling into the tree line behind a stand of sumac, where a gray sedan was already waiting. She did not, as it turned out, ride her bike for exercise at all that day. She rode it approximately a quarter mile, total, in either direction. The rest of the 2.5 hours she spent inside that sedan. We photographed the arrival. We photographed the timestamps. We photographed the man, mid-40s, wedding ring visible in one frame, a build like someone who worked outdoors, walking to his own car afterward and driving off in a direction that, when we ran his plates that evening, led to a house registered to a name that was very much not Renata Hale's. Day 2 was nearly identical, same pull-off, same tree line, different time of day. Day 3, they varied the location slightly, a motel on the edge of the next county over, the kind that rents rooms by the hour and doesn't ask questions, but the pattern held with the reliability of a woman who had simply never imagined anyone would bother to look. There was a moment on day 2 I still think about. We'd parked in a different spot than day 1, further back, an angle that gave us a clean line on the sedan but put us behind a screen of scrub pine that made the footage grainier than I liked. I had the camera up, both hands steady the way 6 years of practice makes them steady, keeping that particular blankness professionals learn to put on, the one that lets you document someone's worst moment without your own feelings getting in the lens. Then Renata laughed. We couldn't hear it, obviously, 200 yards and a closed car window away, but you could see it in the way her head tipped back, easy and unguarded, the kind of laugh a person only produces when they believe, completely, that no one is watching. My hand didn't shake. The shutter kept clicking at its steady rhythm. But my jaw went tight in a way Jake recognized from 100 other surveillance jobs, the particular tightness of someone absorbing a hit and refusing to let it show. She never laughed like that at our dinner table, I said quietly, not lowering the camera. Not once in 22 years. I used to think she just didn't have that in her. Turns out she had it. She just never once thought I was worth using it on. Jake didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. He just kept the engine idling low and let me finish the roll. By the end of the 3rd day, we had 4 hours of continuous, time-stamped, unambiguous documentation. Enough, our attorney friend confirmed over the phone that evening, to make any judge in this state extremely unsympathetic to a custody argument, and any decent divorce lawyer strongly recommend a fast, quiet settlement instead of a fight. I sat in the passenger seat on the drive home from that 3rd day, going through the footage on a small monitor, and I wasn't smiling the way I had that first morning at the kitchen table. I felt tired in a different way, not defeated, but like someone who has finally set down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what my shoulders felt like without it. "You, okay?" Jake asked. "I keep waiting to feel like I thought I'd feel," I said. Vindicated. Triumphant. Instead, I mostly just feel sad for my dad. 22 years, Jake. 22 years of a life he built on the wrong foundation, and it took a stranger on a dark road to finally show him the cracks. "That's not sad," Jake said. "That's the fog lifting. It's supposed to feel like standing outside in weather you're not used to yet." I didn't answer, but I leaned my head against the window and closed my eyes, and Jake let the silence sit, because some silences are doing important work and don't need to be filled. There's a detail from day 3 I want to go back and give its due, because it's going to matter more than either of us understood at the time. The motel where Renata and her lover spent that final afternoon was called the Bellhaven, a squat 2-story building with a faded blue awning that had probably looked cheerful sometime around 1994. We couldn't get a clean angle on the room itself without trespassing in ways that would have compromised the whole case, so Jake went inside, badge from an old contract job still in his wallet for exactly this kind of moment, and struck up a conversation with the woman running the front desk while I waited in the car. Her name was Diane Ashford. Somewhere in her late 50s, sharp-eyed in the particular way of someone who has run a small, slightly disreputable business for a long time and has stopped being surprised by anything human beings do to each other. "You're not the first PI who's ever stood at this counter," she told Jake, not unkindly. "I don't need details. Room 14, the couple that checks in around 1 and leaves by 4, cash only, never any luggage. Been coming here on and off for close to a year now. You want to know if I keep a guest log with names on it, and the answer is yes, and I'll show it to you, Because frankly I'm tired of being the last honest business on a road full of people cheating on each other in my parking lot. She pulled the log without hesitation. Fake names, obviously, but consistent fake names, dated back 11 months, considerably longer than the few months Dale Corbin's message had implied about his own situation, though at the time neither of us thought much of that discrepancy. We were focused on Renata. Jake told me later that Diane mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd run the Belhaven alone since her husband passed 6 years earlier, and that most days the loneliest part wasn't the nights, it was having nobody to tell the funny stuff to. She'd bought the place with her husband the year they got married. 41 years behind that counter, one way or another. I know which families are actually happy, she told Jake, and which ones just look happy in the church parking lot on Sundays. Jake didn't think much of it in the moment beyond noting her as a useful, credible witness for the file. But he mentioned her, later that evening, almost as a throwaway comment to me, and I felt something quick and calculating move through me, the kind of instinct that had rarely steered me wrong in this business. How old did you say she was? Late 50s, maybe. Why? No reason, I said, in the exact tone of voice that means there is absolutely a reason. We chose a Thursday. My father had checked Renata's calendar, a habit he'd apparently developed years ago without ever admitting to himself why he needed it, and confirmed she was flying back from a 3-day business retreat, conveniently scheduled to land at 5:40 p.m. We got to the house at 9 that morning. My father met us at the door looking like a man on the morning of a surgery he'd been dreading and also desperately needed. I don't know if I can watch her face when she sees it, he admitted, standing in the front hallway. You don't have to watch, I told him. You just have to be standing there. We packed. All morning and most of the afternoon, the three of us moved through that house like a small, grim assembly line, my father identifying which items were genuinely his or the children's, me boxing with the brisk efficiency of someone who had spent years packing evidence and now, for once, was packing something that felt like justice instead. Clothes. Shoes. An entire closet of cycling gear that none of us commented on out loud, though my jaw tightened every time I folded another jersey into a box. Framed photographs came off walls, revealing sun-faded rectangles where they'd hung for years. By 4:30, 16 boxes and 2 suitcases sat loaded in the bed of a rented pickup truck in the driveway. We waited in the living room, the three of us, not talking much, the kind of silence that has a held breath inside it. Renata's car pulled into the driveway at 5:52 p.m., 8 minutes past when the flight tracker said she should have landed. She was still in her travel clothes, rolling a small carry-on behind her, and she made it exactly 4 steps up the front walk before she saw the empty spaces on the porch where 2 potted plants used to sit, and something in her face changed. By the time she reached the front door and saw my father standing in the entryway holding a manila envelope, and saw me standing a few feet behind him with an expression I'd practiced in the bathroom mirror that morning, calm, unhurried, almost pleasant, Renata Hale understood exactly what was happening. How could you do this to me, you little bit? Easily, I said, cutting her off before the word finished, my voice perfectly level. And happily. I have watched a lot of confrontations in this line of work. I have never seen anyone's face do what Renata Hale's face did in that doorway, a kind of total collapse of a mask that had been in place for so long she'd probably forgotten it was a mask at all, followed almost instantly by something colder and more calculating, the look of a woman doing rapid math on how bad the numbers were about to get. She looked at the boxes in the truck. She looked at the envelope in my father's hand. She looked, last, at me, and whatever she saw there, or perhaps whatever she didn't see, no flinch, no hesitation, 14 years of practiced coldness finally aimed back at her in full, seemed to be what actually broke her. You have no idea what you've done, she said, quieter now, and there was something underneath the venom that sounded almost like fear. I think we have a pretty good idea, Jake said, stepping forward to hand her our attorney's card. You'll want to call someone. Today, ideally. She did not sleep in that house again. Faced with 4 hours of documented, time-stamped footage, a motel guest log going back nearly a year, and a lawyer of her own who reviewed the file in about 90 seconds and told her, according to my father, who heard it secondhand, that fighting this in court would be a very expensive way to lose. Renata Hale agreed to a settlement inside of 3 weeks. She gave up the house. She gave up any claim to the family assets beyond a modest, negotiated sum. Most strikingly, she agreed to full custody of the 3 children going to my father, which surprised all of us until I pointed out, with a bitterness that had earned every ounce of its right to exist, she never wanted them either, not really. She wanted the life. The kids were just proof she had it. The children, 17, 15, and 12, took the news with the particular resilience of kids who have spent years quietly noticing things adults assumed they hadn't. All 3, within a month, had started calling me by name instead of the careful, distant our stepsister they'd used their whole lives. It should have ended there. For a few weeks, it did. Then, on a Tuesday evening about 5 weeks after the confrontation, Jake sat down to close out our file on the case, and something in Diane Ashford's motel log kept nagging at him the way Dale Corbin's message had nagged at him weeks earlier. 11 months. That's how far back the Bellhaven's records for that particular pair of fake names went. But Dale Corbin's original message had said his own wife's affair had been discovered a few months earlier. If his own situation was only a few months old, why had he been driving that specific stretch of country road, at that specific hour, with the presence of mind to not just glance and drive on but to stop, walk back, take photographs, and run license plates like a man executing a plan rather than a man reacting to a coincidence? Jake pulled his Facebook profile back up. And that's when he found the detail that changed the entire shape of the story. Dale Corbin's Facebook profile had a small, easily missed inconsistency. A comment, 2 years old, on a post from a genealogy hobbyist group, where Dale had written, "Finally got my results back. 46% matched to a half-sibling I never knew existed. Wild ride starts now, I guess." Jake sat with that for a long minute, scrolling back through 18 months of that same genealogy group. A post from 14 months ago narrowed it down to a name. Not ready to reach out yet. Might just drive by sometime, see what kind of life she built. A post from 9 months ago, vaguer, some people don't deserve the benefit of the doubt you want to give them. Working on accepting that. And then nothing, for 5 months, right up until 3 nights before the message landed in my inbox. Jake called me into the office. "I think Dale Corbin is Renata's son," he said. I stared at him like he'd told me the sky was a different color than I remembered. "That's not possible. Renata doesn't have other kids. Dad would know. 14 years of marriage, he'd." "Not from your dad," Jake said. "Before your dad. Renata would have been what, 19, 20, when she married your father?" "That message wasn't a coincidence," I said slowly. "There was no broken-down car. There was no random Good Samaritan stopping to help. He already knew what he was going to find on that road, because he'd been watching for it." "Might be true, might not be, about the wife," Jake said. "I genuinely don't know yet. But either way," I said, feeling something shift behind my own eyes, not anger, not yet, something more complicated. He didn't message me because he stumbled onto a stranger's infidelity and felt a moral obligation. He messaged me because he'd found his birth mother, discovered exactly what kind of person she'd become, and instead of confronting her himself, he used me to do it for him. "I need to talk to him," I said finally. Not accusingly. Just, I need to understand why. We met Dale Corbin at a diner not unlike the one where we'd first shown my father the photographs, my choice, deliberate, because I wanted this conversation to happen somewhere unglamorous too, somewhere nobody could perform for an audience. He was younger than his profile picture suggested, maybe 34, with the solid, watchful build of someone who spends his working life pulling people out of burning buildings. He looked nervous in a way that surprised me, given how composed his original message had been. "I figured you'd work it out eventually," he said. "You run a PI firm. I probably should have assumed you'd look harder at me than most people would." "Is the part about your wife true?" I asked. Not gently. Not unkindly either. Just direct. He looked down at his coffee. Yeah. 3 years ago, not a few months. I lied about the timeline because I needed a reason that wasn't the real one. The real one felt too personal to hand a stranger over Facebook Messenger. So tell us the real one, I said. Dale exhaled slowly and told us a version of his life neither of us had expected. Adopted at 4 days old by a good family 2 counties over, raised well, loved genuinely. But somewhere in his late 20s, a quiet, persistent question had started keeping him up at night: who gave me up, and why? A DNA test 2 years ago had cracked the question open. 6 months of research had led him to Renata Voss Hale. I didn't know what I wanted from her, he said. I told myself I just wanted to see her once, from a distance. I started driving out that way sometimes, on my off days from the station. Never planning to approach her. Just watching. And that's when you noticed the pattern, Jake said. He nodded, looking genuinely uncomfortable. I put it together pretty fast. I've seen enough of my own version of that particular betrayal to recognize the shape of it from a distance. He looked at me. Part of me wanted to protect a mother I'd never even met. And part of me, the bigger part, if I'm honest, felt this ugly kind of vindication. Of course she's capable of this. Of course, the woman who gave me away built a life just as dishonest as the one she left behind. So, you decided to test her, I said quietly. Before you ever decided whether you wanted a relationship with her, you wanted to know what kind of person she actually was. I told myself I was protecting a family I didn't even know, Dale said. Which was true, technically. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is I wanted to see what she'd do when she got caught. And I didn't have the nerve to find out by knocking on her door myself, so I found the one family member I could locate online, and I let her do it for me. He looked genuinely ashamed. I used you. I'm sorry. I thought I'd send a message, maybe never hear back, and that would be the end of it. I was quiet for a long moment, turning my coffee cup slowly on its saucer. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't have the anger I half expected. It had something closer to recognition. Do you know what it's like, I said, to spend your whole childhood being the thing a woman needs erased from her new life? I spent 14 years wondering what was so unforgivable about me that a grown adult would rather send me to boarding school 4 states away than look at me across a dinner table. I looked at him steadily. You spent 34 years wondering what was so unforgivable about you that she gave you away 4 days after you were born. We're not that different, Dale. We just found out about each other's existence from opposite ends of the same woman's ability to walk away from people. Dale turned his coffee cup a slow half-circle on the table, not meeting my eyes. You want to know the part one haven't told anyone? The night I finally saw her clearly enough to know what she was doing on that road, I sat in my truck for almost an hour before I did anything. Trying to decide whether I actually wanted to be the reason her whole life came apart, or whether I just wanted to keep watching from a safe distance forever. And then I thought about the version of me that never got the DNA test done at all, and I realized I was more afraid of staying frozen than I was of whatever came next. He finally looked up. I don't know if that makes what I did better or worse. It makes it human, I said. Which is more than I can say for the woman who raised you never learning that lesson herself. His eyes were wet by the time I finished. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that information. I do, I said. You're supposed to come meet my dad. Not Renata. Not yet, maybe not ever. But you have 3 half-siblings living 15 minutes from here who don't know you exist, and a father figure who just found out his marriage was a lie and might actually appreciate meeting the one good thing that came out of it before he ever met her. When I finally told my father the whole story, the real timeline, the DNA test, 34 years of a son he'd never known his wife had given away before he ever met her, he sat in stunned silence for almost a full minute before he said the thing that, looking back, told me everything about why I had turned out the way I had despite everything. Well, he said finally, voice thick. I suppose I owe that young man an apology on Renata's behalf, even if it's not mine to give. And I owe him a dinner, because it sounds like he's the reason any of us finally got free. The dinner happened 3 weeks later, at my father's house, mine and his now, in every real sense, boxes unpacked, the sun-faded rectangles on the walls slowly filling back in with new photographs that actually included everyone who lived there. Dale came nervous and left, 4 hours later, considerably less so, having spent most of the evening being quietly, thoroughly adopted by 3 teenagers who decided within about 20 minutes that having an older half-brother who fought actual fires for a living was the single coolest development of their entire year. I want to tell you Renata had some kind of reckoning. I can't tell you that, because it isn't true. As far as any of us know, Renata never learned that Dale Corbin was her son at all. She moved 2 states away within 6 months of the settlement and started, presumably, the exact same pattern somewhere new, with someone else's marriage, someone else's family. Some people don't change. The best you can do, sometimes, is get the people you love clear of them, and let the rest of the story belong to whoever comes next. Here's where I get to tell you about Diane Ashford, because I promised her a place in this story. About 4 months after the settlement, my father needed to drop off a folder of finalized paperwork at our office, and I invited Diane Ashford to stop by around the same time to close out some paperwork of her own, a fairly transparent lie for a woman who'd already given us everything she had to give. My father, 61 years old and newly divorced from a woman who'd spent 2 decades making him feel like an inconvenience in his own life, walked into our office and found himself shaking hands with a sharp-eyed, dry-humored woman roughly his own age who'd grown up 2 towns over from him and briefly attended the same high school, a fact neither of them had ever had reason to discover before. I will not pretend I orchestrated some elaborate romance. What I will tell you is that Diane laughed at something my father said within about 90 seconds of meeting him, the real laugh, the one that came out of nowhere and surprised even her, and my father, who I had genuinely never once seen smile without some shadow of guilt behind it, smiled like a man who'd forgotten he was allowed to. They've been seeing each other 7 months now. Slow, careful, the way 2 people who've each survived their own version of loneliness tend to move. My father told me, a few weeks back, that Diane was the first person in longer than I can remember who makes me feel like good things aren't something I have to be suspicious of. I cried a little when he told me that, and I understood exactly why. It was the same fear that had made me wait 24 hours before believing a stranger's good news. Turns out it runs in the family, and turns out it's the kind of fear that can, eventually, be talked out of its corner. As for my father and me, we talk most days now. Sunday dinners, actual ones, the kind with all 4 kids at the table and photographs on the walls that don't skip anyone. He still apologizes sometimes, out of nowhere, for the 14 years he let slide by, and I've gotten better at telling him, and meaning it, that the apology isn't owed anymore, that the years since have started to outweigh it. Dale still comes to dinner about once a month. He and I have become, in the strange way that shared damage sometimes builds real closeness, something like actual siblings, in all the ways that matter more than blood ever did on its own. He never did reach out to Renata. He told me once that he thinks he already got the answer he was looking for, and it wasn't the one he'd hoped for, but it was, at least, honest. And me? I run a PI firm with a man who watched me spend my whole childhood learning betrayal in slow motion, and then watched me spend my whole adult life exposing it in other people's families for a living, without ever once connecting the two until a stranger on a dark country road handed me the connection I'd been avoiding for 20 years. I've watched a lot of people get caught in this business. I've watched a lot of marriages end in parking lots and driveways and hotel lobbies. But I have never, not once, not before, not since, felt anything land the way that manila envelope landed in my father's driveway, on the day I finally, after 2 decades, got to say 2 words to the woman who'd stolen my childhood, and mean every syllable of them. Easily. And happily. Some doors, once they're finally open, don't just let the truth out. They let everyone standing behind them back in, too, the daughter, the son nobody knew to look for, the man who'd spent 22 years apologizing to a ghost, and, eventually, a woman running a motel office who'd been waiting a long time for someone to laugh with again. That's the part nobody tells you about revenge, the kind that actually works. It was never really about her losing. It was about all the people her leaving had frozen in place finally getting to move again.